When I announced my pregnancy, my mother-in-law said, "Abort it before you curse our family with a defective child." She said it at the family dinner table in front of everyone while my husband Thomas sat frozen, and his father nodded in agreement, and I was holding the ultrasound photos of our healthy 12-week baby. "Your family has that Down syndrome gene. My perfect son shouldn't have his bloodline contaminated with your inferior genetics." My cousin had Down syndrome and was one of the happiest, most loving people I knew, but Margaret saw him as a stain on humanity. "There's no Down syndrome gene that runs in families like that. It's usually random chromosomal changes." Margaret laughed coldly. "Don't lie to me. Your aunt had one. That means you're a carrier. Thomas deserves healthy, normal children, not whatever damaged thing you'll produce." She grabbed the ultrasound photos and threw them in the trash. "These are meaningless until genetic testing proves the child is normal, which it won't be because you're defective." Thomas finally spoke, but not to defend me. "Mom has a point. Maybe we should do testing." I stared at my husband. "Testing is fine, but she's saying to abort based on family history that isn't even medically accurate." Margaret stood up and walked over to me. "I've researched your bloodline. Weak genes, mental illness, birth defects. You're poisoning my grandchildren before they're even born. My family had one cousin with Down syndrome and an aunt with depression. Your family isn't genetically perfect either, Margaret. Your brother has diabetes. Your mother had cancer." She slapped the table. "Those are different. Those are physical ailments that can be treated. You're talking about bringing a burden into this world. Someone who will drain resources and embarrass the family." She meant a child who might have disabilities would embarrass her. "Any child of mine will be loved regardless of ability." Margaret turned to Thomas. "Do you hear this? She's willing to saddle you with a defective child. The medical bills, the special schools, the lifetime of care. Is that what you want?" Thomas looked uncomfortable. "I mean, if we can prevent it through testing." His father Richard joined in. "No grandchild of mine will be retarded. We have a reputation in this community. What would people think? They'd think what they already thought, that the Rossies were horrible people. People with Down syndrome aren't defective or burdens. They're human beings." Margaret laughed cruelly. "Human beings who can't live independently, who'll never contribute to society, who'll spend their lives drooling and babbling." That was completely false and showed she knew nothing about Down syndrome. I stood up to leave, but Margaret grabbed my arm. "You're not going anywhere until you agree to genetic testing and abortion if necessary." I pulled away. "I'll do testing for my own knowledge, but I'm not aborting based on your prejudice." She turned to Thomas again. "Control your wife, or I'll do it for you. No defective babies in this family." Thomas looked at me with an expression I'd never seen. "Maybe we should consider all options. Mom knows about these things." His mother knew nothing about genetics or disabilities, just prejudice. "Your mother is a bigot, Thomas." Margaret gasped dramatically. "How dare you!" The next day, she brought pamphlets about termination to our house. "I've made you an appointment. The doctor is discreet. No one will know about your defective pregnancy." I was 16 weeks and the baby was healthy. "I'm not terminating a healthy pregnancy." She threw the papers at me. "It's not healthy if it comes from you. Your genes are contaminated. Even if this one is normal, the next might not be." She decided all my pregnancies would be suspect. "Then I guess you won't be involved in any of my children's lives." Margaret laughed. "Thomas won't choose you over his family. He knows where his loyalty lies." That night, Thomas proved her right. "Maybe we should wait to have kids. Mom's really upset about the genetic risks." I looked at the man I'd married. "Your mother is wrong. Medically, scientifically, morally wrong." He suggested something horrible. "It's not too late for other options. Mom says she knows a doctor who would still do it." His mother had found someone willing to perform a late-term abortion for no medical reason. "You want me to abort our healthy baby because your mother is prejudiced?" He got defensive. "She's not prejudiced. If something's wrong with it, we'll be stuck forever." Something wrong with it. Our baby was an it that might be defective. I packed my bags that night. Thomas didn't try to stop me. "Where will you go? Who'll want a single mother with potentially defective children?" I moved in with my parents, who were thrilled about the baby. My cousin with Down syndrome was especially excited to be an uncle. The divorce was quick. The drama unfolds when I gave birth. My childhood bedroom looked the same as when I left for college, with the faded posters still on the walls and my old desk pushed against the window. Mom had already cleared out half the closet and was unfolding a portable changing table in the corner before Dad even finished carrying in the last box from my car. She moved fast, pulling out receiving blankets and tiny onesies she must have bought the second I told her I was pregnant, stacking them on the dresser with careful hands. Dad set down the box and squeezed my shoulder without saying anything, which somehow meant more than words would have. I sat on the edge of my bed and watched Mom arrange baby supplies, and for the first time since that dinner at the Rossi house, I didn't feel completely alone. The doorbell rang around 7, and I heard Roman's voice downstairs, louder and more excited than usual. He came bounding up the stairs with something tucked under his arm, grinning so wide his whole face lit up. He held out a stuffed gray elephant with floppy ears and a red ribbon around its neck. "For the baby," he said, pressing it into my hands. I picked it myself at the store. The lady said elephants are good luck. I looked at the elephant, and then at Roman's hopeful face, and something inside me just broke open. Happy tears, the kind I hadn't cried in what felt like forever, streamed down my cheeks while Roman hugged me carefully, patting my back like I was fragile. "You're going to be the best mom," he said. and I'm going to be the best uncle. I believed him completely. My phone started ringing the next morning before I even got out of bed. Thomas's name lit up the screen and I let it go to voicemail, pulling the covers over my head. He called again 20 minutes later, then again an hour after that. By the end of the first day, I had 7 missed calls. I finally listened to the messages that night while Mom made dinner downstairs. His voice sounded strained, apologizing but not really apologizing. I know you're upset, but we should talk about this reasonably. Mom's just worried about us, about the future. Maybe I said things wrong, but you have to understand the pressure I'm under. The next message was more defensive. You can't just leave like this. We need to discuss our options like adults. I'm trying to see your side, but you're being stubborn. By day 3, the messages shifted tone again. Mom thinks we should all sit down together and clear the air. She wants to help us through this. Can you at least call me back? I deleted each one after listening, feeling my anger build with every word he didn't say. He never once admitted that what he suggested was wrong, never acknowledged calling our baby an it, or agreeing with his mother's demands to abort. Every message framed it like I was the unreasonable one, like I was overreacting to legitimate concerns instead of running from cruelty. The final message came on day 7. Mom really wants to talk to you directly. She thinks there's been a misunderstanding. Can you please just hear her out? I blocked his number right there, sitting on my childhood bed with the stuffed elephant Roman gave me on my lap. The law office of Webster and Associates occupied the second floor of a brick building downtown, with a waiting room that smelled like coffee and old books. Gideon Webster was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with gray starting at his temples and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He listened without interrupting while I told him the whole story, from Margaret's demand at the dinner table to Thomas suggesting late-term abortion to his parting shot about no one wanting a single mother with defective children. I watched his expression shift from professional neutral to barely contained anger. What they did constitutes emotional abuse, he said, leaning forward with his hands clasped on the desk. Margaret's coercion attempts, Thomas's threats and manipulation, his family's harassment, this creates a documented pattern that family courts take very seriously. The fact that he suggested terminating a healthy pregnancy at 16 weeks based solely on his mother's prejudice, that's going to matter. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and started taking notes. Thomas's exact words about the baby being defective, his mother finding a doctor willing to perform an unnecessary late-term procedure. These details are crucial. This isn't just about divorce. It's about protecting your child from people who've already demonstrated they view them as less than human. Explained that custody arrangements would heavily favor me given Thomas's abandonment and his family's documented hostility toward the pregnancy. We're going to file for full physical and legal custody with supervised visitation only, and we're going to make sure Margaret Rossi is never allowed near your child without explicit court approval. Hearing a legal professional confirm that what happened was genuinely terrible, not just me being oversensitive or hormonal like Thomas implied, made something tight in my chest finally loosen. You did the right thing leaving, Gideon said, and we're going to make sure you and your baby are protected. 3 days later, Margaret showed up at my parents' house. I was upstairs resting when I heard the doorbell, then raised voices from the front porch. Dad's voice was firm and cold in a way I'd never heard before. You're not welcome here, Margaret. You need to leave. Her voice carried through the window. I have a right to discuss the situation with my daughter-in-law. This is a family matter. She's not your daughter-in-law anymore, and you have no rights here. Leave now. I heard her try to push past him, her heels scraping on the porch, and Dad's voice rose. I said leave. You're trespassing. Mom appeared in my doorway, phone already in her hand. I'm calling the police. Stay up here. She disappeared back downstairs, and I heard her speaking calmly to the dispatcher, giving our address and explaining that someone was refusing to leave the property after being asked multiple times. Margaret's voice got louder, more shrill. You can't keep me from my grandchild. I have rights. That baby is a Rossi. Dad's response was ice. That baby is none of your concern. You demanded its mother abort it. You called it defective. You have no rights here. The police arrived within 10 minutes, and I watched from my bedroom window as 2 officers escorted Margaret off the property, her face red and twisted with rage. She kept yelling about her rights, about family, about how I was poisoning everyone against her. The officers put her in the back of the patrol car and talked to Dad and Mom on the porch for another 20 minutes, taking notes. Dad went to the courthouse the next morning and filed for a restraining order. The temporary order was granted that same day. The ultrasound room was dim and cool, with the monitor angled so I could see the screen clearly. I was 18 weeks now, and the technician squeezed gel on my belly before pressing the wand against my skin. The baby appeared on the screen immediately, so much bigger than at 12 weeks, with a clearly defined head and body and tiny fingers I could actually count. The technician measured and clicked, taking images from different angles, and her voice was warm when she spoke. Baby's developing beautifully. All the measurements are exactly where they should be. Heart rate is perfect. No signs of any abnormalities. She showed me the 4 chambers of the heart, the spine, the brain, each part forming exactly as it should. Everything looks completely healthy. Julie Nelson, my new pediatrician, came in after the ultrasound to review the genetic screening results I'd done at 16 weeks. She was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and steady hands that moved confidently through the papers on her clipboard. Your screening came back with very low risk for all chromosomal conditions, including Down syndrome. The baby's development is perfect. She pulled up a chair and looked at me directly. I understand your former mother-in-law has some concerns about genetic inheritance. I want to explain why her understanding is medically inaccurate. She went through it point by point, explaining that Down syndrome is caused by random chromosomal changes during cell division, not inherited genes passed down through families. Having a cousin with Down syndrome doesn't make you a carrier. It doesn't increase your risk. The condition your mother-in-law described simply doesn't exist in the way she thinks it does. She offered to write a detailed letter for Gideon documenting the baby's health and the medical impossibility of Margaret's claims. Sometimes people need to see official documentation to understand they're wrong. I'm happy to provide that for your legal case. Gideon called me 4 days after the ultrasound, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Thomas's lawyer just sent over divorce papers. You need to see these terms. He read them to me over the phone and I felt my face get hot. The papers demanded paternity testing before Thomas would agree to any financial support and included a clause stating Thomas would have no financial responsibility if the baby was born with significant disabilities. They're actually trying to write an escape clause based on your child's health. This is one of the most insulting sets of terms I've ever seen. He was already drafting a counter motion. We're including evidence of the Rossi family's harassment, Margaret's coercion attempts, Thomas's suggestion of late-term abortion, and his abandonment when you were 16 weeks pregnant. We're going to fight for full custody and substantial child support based on his emotional abuse and his family's documented pattern of harassment. He explained that Thomas's attempt to avoid responsibility for a child with disabilities would work against him in court. Judges don't look kindly on parents who try to opt out of supporting their children based on health conditions. This shows exactly who he is, and it's going to help our case significantly. We spent an hour going through every detail, building a timeline of Margaret's behavior and Thomas's complicity. The restraining order against Margaret, her violation attempts, Thomas's continued defense of her actions, all of this creates a picture of a toxic family environment that your child needs protection from. Gideon's voice was firm. We're not just getting you a divorce. We're making sure your daughter is safe from these people. Esther Major's therapy office was on the ground floor of a converted house, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs that didn't feel clinical. She was maybe 50, with kind eyes and a calm presence that made it easy to talk. I'd booked twice-weekly sessions because I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop replaying that dinner table scene, couldn't stop hearing Thomas call our baby an it. The first session, I cried for 45 minutes straight while Esther handed me tissues and listened. Your grief is valid, she said. You're mourning the man you thought you married and discovering he's someone different under pressure. She helped me understand that Thomas's inability to stand up to his mother wasn't a flaw I could have fixed with patience or love. This is who he is. His cruelty revealed his true character, not a temporary lapse. People show you who they are in crisis, and he showed you clearly. The sessions became a place where I could separate the relationship I thought I had from the reality of what it actually was. You loved the version of Thomas who existed when his mother wasn't involved, when there was no real test of his loyalty. But that version wasn't complete. The man who suggested aborting your healthy baby because his mother demanded it, that's also him. That's the real him. Esther never let me minimize what happened or make excuses for his behavior. He chose his mother's prejudice over your child's life. That's not something you caused or could have prevented. That's his choice, and it tells you everything you need to know. By the end of the second week, I was sleeping better, eating regularly again, starting to accept that the marriage ending wasn't my failure. It was his. Roman asked me at Sunday dinner if he could come to my next ultrasound appointment. I want to see the baby on the screen. I want to see my niece or nephew moving around. Mom and Dad exchanged a look, and I realized they were tearing up. Of course you can come, I said. I'd love that. The 20-week ultrasound was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and Roman took the morning off from his job at the grocery store. He sat in the chair next to the exam table, leaning forward to see the monitor. His whole face lit up with excitement. The technician smiled at him while she moved the wand across my belly. There's the baby. You can see the head here and the body, and look, the baby's moving. Roman gasped like he'd seen something magical. The baby kicked on screen and he grabbed my hand. Did you see that? The baby kicked. He asked a million questions. What's that part? Is that the heart? How big is the baby now? Can the baby hear us? The technician answered each one patiently, showing him different angles, explaining what each measurement meant. Can I have copies of the pictures? I want to keep them in my wallet. She printed out extra images and Roman held them carefully, studying each one like it was precious art. I'm going to be the best uncle, he told the baby through my belly. I'm going to teach you everything. The technician wiped her eyes and I realized she was crying. Sorry, she said. That was just really sweet. Watching Roman's pure joy, his genuine excitement about being part of this baby's life, I realized this was what family support actually looked like. Not demands and threats and coercion, just love. The certified letter arrived at my parents' house 6 days after the restraining order was issued. Mom brought it up to my room with a worried expression. It's from Margaret. I opened it carefully, already knowing this was a violation. Inside were 20 pages of printed articles about genetic testing, termination procedures, and prenatal screening. Margaret had highlighted sections in yellow and written notes in the margins. See, this proves genetic risks are hereditary. Testing is essential before committing to pregnancy. Late termination is medically justified in these cases. None of the articles actually supported her claims. Most were from questionable websites, and the legitimate medical sources she'd included directly contradicted her interpretation. One article specifically stated that Down syndrome is not inherited through family lines. I took photos of every page and sent them to Gideon. He called back within an hour. This is a clear restraining order violation. She's not allowed to contact you in any way, and she sent a certified letter directly to your address. I'm adding this to our legal file and notifying the court immediately. The judge reviewed the violation 2 days later and extended the restraining order for another year. Ms. Rossi, you were explicitly ordered to have no contact with the plaintiff. This letter constitutes direct contact and continued harassment. Any further violations will result in jail time. Do you understand? I wasn't in the courtroom, but Gideon told me Margaret tried to argue that she was just sharing important medical information. The judge shut that down immediately. The restraining order is clear. No contact means no contact. Consider this your final warning. The prenatal class met every Thursday evening in a conference room at the hospital, with folding chairs arranged in a circle and a cheerful instructor named Sandra. I walked in nervous, the only person there alone, but Sandra welcomed me warmly and introduced me to the group. There were 6 other couples and 1 other single mom, a guy named Cole who looked as uncomfortable as I felt. Sandra had us do icebreaker exercises and Cole ended up as my partner. My ex-wife is pregnant, he said quietly. We're getting divorced, but I still want to be involved with the baby. It's complicated. I understood complicated. We bonded immediately over navigating single parenthood preparation, swapping stories about lawyers and family drama, and the weird loneliness of going through pregnancy without a partner. Cole was easy to talk to, with a self-deprecating sense of humor that made me laugh for the first time in weeks. At least we're not dealing with this alone, he said, gesturing at the class. Even if we're technically alone. The class covered everything from labor positions to newborn care to breastfeeding basics, and having Cole there as a friend made it less overwhelming. We exchanged numbers after the second class and started texting regularly, sharing articles we found and asking each other questions about baby gear. His presence became a steady comfort, someone who understood the complicated emotions of preparing for a baby while grieving a marriage. We're going to be okay, he said after the 4th class, walking me to my car. We're doing the work, learning what we need to know. Our kids are going to be fine. I believed him, or at least I wanted to. 3 weeks after Cole walked me to my car, Thomas's lawyer sent an email to Gideon requesting a meeting between Thomas and me with both attorneys present. Gideon called me immediately after receiving it. His voice was careful when he asked if I wanted to consider it. I sat at my parents' kitchen table staring at my phone and feeling my stomach tighten. The last time I'd seen Thomas was the night I packed my bags while he sat on our couch asking who would want me. Gideon said we didn't have to agree to anything, and that these meetings sometimes made things worse instead of better. I thought about it for 2 days before calling him back and saying yes. Mom looked worried when I told her. Dad asked if I was sure and reminded me that Thomas had his chance to be decent, and chose his mother instead. But I needed to hear what Thomas had to say. Needed to know if any part of the man I married still existed under Margaret's control. The meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon at a conference room in a building downtown that neither lawyer's office used. Neutral territory that belonged to nobody. I arrived 10 minutes early with Gideon and we sat in hard plastic chairs in the waiting area until Thomas showed up with his lawyer. Thomas looked terrible in a way that surprised me. His suit hung loose like he'd lost weight and his face had a grayish tone that made him look sick. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he wasn't sleeping. His lawyer was a sharp woman in her 50s who shook hands with Gideon and nodded politely at me without smiling. We all walked into the conference room together and sat on opposite sides of a long table. The room smelled like cleaning products and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Thomas kept his eyes on the table for the first few minutes while his lawyer reviewed the purpose of the meeting. Then he finally looked up at me. He started by saying he was sorry for how things happened. His voice was quiet, and he kept his hands folded on the table in front of him. I watched his face and waited for him to say something real. Then he added that his mother was just worried about him being trapped in a difficult situation, and that she'd only been trying to protect him from making a mistake he'd regret. The words hit me like cold water. Not an apology for what he'd said or done, but an apology for the outcome. Not taking responsibility for calling our baby defective or suggesting abortion to please Margaret, but expressing regret that I'd reacted badly to his mother's concerns. I looked at Gideon and saw his jaw tighten. Thomas kept talking about how stressful everything had been, and how he never meant for things to get this bad. He said maybe we'd both overreacted, and that his mom really did have valid concerns about genetic testing. I felt something inside me go completely cold. This wasn't remorse. This was Thomas trying to rewrite history, so he could feel better about his choices. Gideon asked Thomas's lawyer if there was a specific proposal they wanted to discuss. The lawyer glanced at Thomas and then said he wanted to talk about the baby's future. Thomas shifted in his chair and looked at me with an expression that might have been meant to seem sincere. He said he'd been thinking a lot about everything, and he didn't actually want to be a father right now. The words came out slowly like he was testing how they'd sound. His lawyer jumped in to say that Thomas recognized he wasn't ready for the responsibilities of parenthood, given his current life circumstances. Then Thomas asked if I'd consider allowing his parents to adopt the baby. The conference room went completely silent. I stared at him, unable to process what I'd just heard. He wanted me to give my child to Margaret, to the woman who'd called my baby defective and demanded I abort. To the woman who'd thrown my ultrasound photos in the trash and told me my genes were contaminated. Thomas kept talking about how his parents had resources and experience and could provide stability. He said it would be better for everyone if the baby was raised by people who were ready, and that I could still be involved somehow. Maybe visits or something they could work out. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. Gideon put a hand on my arm, but I pulled away and walked to the window. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs. The audacity of Thomas sitting there suggesting I hand my daughter over to his mother made me so angry I couldn't form words. Behind me, I heard Gideon's voice cold and sharp, telling Thomas's lawyer that this meeting was over. He said we were done negotiating anything beyond basic divorce terms and child support. Thomas tried to say something, but Gideon cut him off and said if Thomas wasn't interested in being a father, then he could sign away his rights. But there was absolutely no scenario where Margaret Rossi would ever have custody of my child. I heard chairs moving and papers shuffling. Gideon touched my shoulder gently and said we were leaving. I walked out of that conference room without looking back at Thomas. 2 days later, my friend Jessica called me sounding uncomfortable and said she needed to tell me something. We'd been friends since college, and she still moved in some of the same social circles as Thomas's family. She said Margaret had been talking to people at the country club and at charity events, telling anyone who would listen that I was mentally unstable. According to Margaret's version of events, I was the one who'd wanted an abortion, because I was afraid of having a disabled child, and when Thomas refused, I'd made up lies about his family to justify leaving him. Now I was trying to trap Thomas with a baby and demanding money while spreading horrible rumors about Margaret who'd only ever tried to help me. Jessica said most people seemed to believe Margaret because she was calm and sympathetic when she told the story, while I wasn't around to defend myself. She said Margaret was painting herself as the concerned mother-in-law trying to protect her son from a manipulative, unstable woman. The rumors were so completely backwards from reality that I almost laughed. Margaret had turned the truth inside out and made herself the victim. I told Gideon about the rumors during our next meeting. He leaned back in his chair and said Margaret was building a narrative to protect herself and Thomas from social consequences. He said it was actually helpful in a legal sense because it showed her pattern of manipulation and dishonesty. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. He told me I needed to document everything and get written statements from everyone who was at that family dinner. We needed proof of what Margaret actually said and did before memories faded or people changed their stories. He asked if there was anyone from Thomas's family who might be willing to tell the truth. I thought about Thomas's younger sister who'd sat at that dinner table looking horrified but silent. Her name was Mira, and we'd always gotten along well before everything fell apart. She was 6 years younger than Thomas and had always seemed uncomfortable with Margaret's controlling behavior. I hadn't talked to her since I left, but Gideon said it was worth trying. I texted Mira that evening asking if we could talk. She responded within an hour saying yes and suggesting coffee the next day. We met at a small cafe near her apartment, and she looked nervous when she sat down across from me. Her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and she wouldn't quite meet my eyes at first. I asked her directly if she remembered what Margaret said at the family dinner, and if she'd be willing to write down what happened. Mira's eyes filled with tears, and she said she'd been feeling terrible about not speaking up. She said she was horrified by what Margaret demanded, and disgusted by how Thomas just sat there, but she'd been too scared to say anything. Margaret had a way of punishing family members who defied her, and Mira still lived in the same city and saw them regularly. But she said what Margaret did was wrong and she couldn't let it stand. She agreed to provide a written statement about everything she witnessed that night. She described Margaret grabbing the ultrasound photos and throwing them away. She remembered Margaret saying I should abort before I cursed the family with a defective child. She documented Richard's comment about not wanting a disabled grandchild, and Thomas's suggestion that his mother had a point. Her statement was detailed and specific, and she signed it in front of a notary the following week. Gideon said her testimony would be crucial evidence that Margaret did demand I abort the baby. At 24 weeks pregnant, I was sitting in Mom's kitchen one afternoon when I felt the baby kick strongly for the first time. It wasn't the little flutters I'd felt before, but a real solid movement that made me gasp. Mom looked up from chopping vegetables and asked what was wrong. I put my hand on my belly and felt another kick and started crying. Mom dropped the knife and came over, putting her hand next to mine on my stomach. She waited quietly, and then her eyes went wide when she felt the baby move. She started crying too and pulled me into a hug, telling me she remembered when she was pregnant with me and felt me kick for the first time. She said it was the moment everything became real for her, when she truly understood there was a whole person growing inside her. Dad came home from work an hour later and found us still sitting at the kitchen table with our hands on my belly. Mom made him put his hand there too, and we all waited until the baby kicked again. Dad's face lit up and he started talking to my stomach in this soft, gentle voice, welcoming his grandchild and promising to teach them how to fish and fix cars, and all the things he'd taught me. I felt overwhelmed sitting there with both my parents talking to my daughter and realized she was going to know this kind of love from the moment she was born. She'd never experienced Margaret's coldness or Thomas's weakness because I'd chosen to protect her from that toxicity. Thomas's lawyer sent over the divorce papers the following week. Gideon called me to review the terms before I saw them. The child support amount was minimal, barely enough to cover basics, and clearly calculated to give Thomas the least possible financial obligation. The custody arrangement gave Thomas only supervised visitation until the child turned 5 years old, with the possibility of requesting expanded rights after completing parenting classes and anger management. Gideon said the terms made it clear Thomas wanted as little responsibility as possible. It hurt seeing it written out in legal language that my daughter's father had no interest in actually being her father. But Gideon pointed out that the custody terms actually protected my daughter from the Rossi family's toxicity. Supervised visitation meant Margaret could never be alone with her, and I'd have primary control over my child's life. Gideon said we could push for better child support, but the custody arrangement was actually more favorable than what we might get if we went to court. Thomas was essentially giving up his rights while maintaining a legal connection. I signed the papers after Gideon added language strengthening the supervision requirements and clarifying that Margaret was never allowed contact with the child without my explicit written permission. Around 26 weeks, I started having panic attacks about giving birth. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning with my heart racing and my chest tight, imagining Margaret somehow showing up at the hospital. The restraining order was in place, but I kept picturing her pushing past security, or Thomas bringing her despite the legal consequences. The fear got so bad I started avoiding thinking about the birth at all, which Esther said wasn't healthy. During our next therapy session, she helped me create a detailed birth plan that included hospital security protocols. We wrote down exactly who was allowed in the delivery room and made a list of people who were absolutely forbidden. Esther suggested I meet with the hospital social worker to discuss my concerns and set up protections. I scheduled a meeting the following week and explained the entire situation to a kind woman who took notes and promised to flag my file. Julie coordinated with the hospital to add security alerts, so anyone from the Rossi family trying to access the maternity ward would trigger an immediate response. Having concrete plans in place helped ease some of the anxiety, though I still had nightmares about Margaret's face appearing in the delivery room. Roman called me one evening sounding excited and said he'd signed up for a class on infant CPR and baby safety at the community center. He wanted to be a helpful uncle and know how to take care of his niece properly. I felt my throat tighten listening to him talk about learning to support a baby's head and recognize choking hazards. His dedication and pure excitement about becoming an uncle made me ashamed I'd ever doubted that people with Down syndrome were capable of meaningful relationships and responsibilities. Roman was going to be a better uncle than Thomas would ever be a father. He finished the class 3 weeks later and showed me his certificate with obvious pride. He'd scored perfectly on the final test, and the instructor had complimented his careful attention to detail. Watching him demonstrate proper CPR technique on a baby doll, I realized Margaret's entire worldview was built on ignorance and hate. Roman was capable and loving and excited to help raise my daughter, while Thomas couldn't even commit to supervised visits. The divorce was finalized when I was 28 weeks pregnant. Gideon called to say the judge had signed off on all the terms, including the child support amount he'd negotiated up from Thomas's initial offer, and the supervised visitation requirements. Thomas had to complete parenting classes and anger management before being allowed any unsupervised time with the baby. The settlement included the clause about Margaret never having contact without my explicit written permission. Gideon said it was done and I was legally free from Thomas. I sat in my childhood bedroom after hanging up the phone and put my hand on my belly, feeling the baby move. My daughter would grow up knowing her parents were divorced before she was born, but she'd also grow up surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. That seemed like a fair trade. Margaret tried to interfere one more time 2 weeks later. Julie's office called me sounding concerned and said someone claiming to be my mother had contacted them asking about my test results and due date. The receptionist had been suspicious because the voice didn't match the emergency contact information, and the questions seemed off. She'd refused to give any information and reported the attempted HIPAA violation to Julie, who immediately called me. I knew it was Margaret. She was still trying to get information about my pregnancy, still trying to exert control. Julie filed a formal complaint with the medical board and contacted the authorities about the violation. Gideon used the incident to file for a permanent restraining order that would extend to my child after birth. We went before the judge 3 days later with documentation of Margaret's escalating harassment pattern, including the letter violation and now the attempted medical records breach. The judge granted the permanent restraining order and warned Margaret that any contact with me or my child would result in immediate arrest and jail time. Margaret's lawyer tried to argue she was just a concerned grandmother, but the judge cut him off and said concerned grandmothers don't violate restraining orders and impersonate patients' mothers to access private medical records. I found a small apartment 2 blocks from my parents' house and signed the lease the same week. Dad showed up with his truck and 3 guys from my prenatal class, including Cole, who'd become a real friend over the past few weeks. We carried boxes up 2 flights of stairs and assembled furniture while I directed traffic from the couch where Mom had parked me with strict orders to rest. Cole struggled with the crib instructions, and we both laughed about how neither of us expected to be doing this without our partners. The apartment was modest, with worn carpet and a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, but it was mine and nobody could tell me what to do here. I painted the nursery walls a soft yellow and hung green curtains Mom had sewn, creating a peaceful space that felt nothing like the cold perfection Margaret would have demanded. Dad installed extra locks on the door and a peephole, practical safety measures that made me feel protected. By the end of moving day, I was exhausted but satisfied, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and people who actually cared about me and my baby. At my 30-week appointment, Julie's face got serious when she checked my blood pressure. She took it 3 times and then told me the numbers were higher than she liked, and I needed to come back in 2 days for monitoring. The stress of everything had caught up to me physically, and my body was showing the strain. She put me on modified bed rest, which meant no work and minimal activity, just resting and trying to keep my blood pressure down. Mom took time off from her job at the library to stay with me during the day, making me healthy meals and timing my blood pressure readings every few hours. Roman came over after his shift at the grocery store where he bagged groceries and helped stock shelves, settling in to watch movies with me and keep me company. He'd bring snacks and tell me about his day, and his presence was surprisingly calming during a time when I felt anxious about every little change in my body. We watched comedies and he'd laugh at all the jokes, his joy infectious enough to distract me from worrying about preeclampsia and early labor. Julie monitored me closely over the next 2 weeks, and my blood pressure gradually came back down to safer levels, proving that rest and support actually worked. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize, and I almost ignored it until I saw Thomas's name in the message. He'd gotten a new number to get around my blocks and was texting to say his mother was hurt that I wouldn't let her be involved, and that I was being vindictive by keeping her grandchild away from family. The audacity of him still defending her after everything she'd done made my hands shake with anger. I took a screenshot of the message for Gideon and then blocked the new number, amazed that Thomas still didn't understand that Margaret's behavior had earned these consequences. She'd demanded I abort my baby, called my family defective, violated a restraining order, and tried to access my medical records illegally. His inability to hold his mother accountable for any of it told me everything I needed to know about why our marriage had failed. He'd chosen her over me and our child repeatedly, and now he was surprised I didn't want her anywhere near my daughter. I sent the screenshot to Gideon with a note about the contact, and he responded that he'd document it as harassment. Thomas would never get it, and I was done trying to make him see reality. Cole called a few days later sounding nervous and asked if I wanted to come to his baby shower that his sister was throwing. I hadn't expected an invitation since we'd only known each other a few months, but he said I was one of his closest friends now, and he wanted me there. His sister lived in a nice house across town, and when I arrived with Mom, the place was full of Cole's family members who welcomed me like I belonged there. His sister hugged me and introduced me to everyone, explaining that I was Cole's friend from prenatal class who understood what he was going through. She pulled me aside later while we were eating cake and told me she was glad Cole had someone who got it, someone who knew what it felt like to prepare for a baby alone after a marriage fell apart. She gave me her number and said to call if I ever needed anything, whether it was advice or just someone to talk to who understood. The kindness from these near strangers hit me hard after months of cruelty from my ex-husband's family. Cole's family asked about my due date and my plans and seemed genuinely interested, treating me with warmth and respect. I watched Cole open gifts and laugh with his relatives and felt grateful I'd found this friendship when I needed it most. Mom and I started a childbirth education class at the hospital where she'd be my birth partner since Thomas had abandoned that role. We practiced breathing techniques on yoga mats while the instructor walked us through different labor positions. Mom held my hand and counted breaths with me, patient and steady through all the exercises. During a break, she told me stories about when she was pregnant with me, how Dad had panicked and driven too fast to the hospital, and how she'd labored for 18 hours before I finally arrived. She promised she'd be there for every moment of my labor if I wanted her there, holding my hand and supporting me however I needed. The instructor praised Mom for being such an attentive birth partner, and I realized I wasn't actually doing this alone even though Thomas had left. I had my mother's steady support and love, which was worth more than a husband who couldn't stand up to his own mother. We practiced different positions for managing contractions, and Mom wrote down notes about what seemed to work best for me. Other couples in the class had partners who looked nervous or uncomfortable, but Mom was calm and confident, ready to help me through whatever came. At 34 weeks, Julie did an ultrasound and confirmed the baby was head down in perfect position for delivery. Everything looked great for a normal birth, and Julie reviewed my birth plan, adding detailed notes to my chart about the security concerns regarding the Rossi family. She flagged my file so that hospital security would be notified if anyone from that family tried to access the maternity ward. The hospital social worker came in afterward to meet with me and discuss my rights as a patient, and the protocols they had in place to protect people from unwanted visitors. She explained that I could have a security guard stationed outside my room during labor and delivery if I wanted, and that no one would be given any information about me or my baby without my explicit permission. They'd dealt with family situations like mine before, and took patient safety seriously. I signed forms authorizing only specific people to visit me and receive information, a list that included my parents, Roman, and a few close friends, but absolutely no one from the Rossi family. The social worker assured me they'd enforce my wishes, and that Margaret wouldn't get anywhere near me or my baby. Knowing the hospital had my back made me feel safer about the actual birth. I woke up one morning at 35 weeks with sharp pains in my belly that sent me into immediate panic. I was convinced I was going into early labor and grabbed my phone to call Mom with shaking hands. She came over within minutes and started timing the contractions, watching the clock while I breathed through the discomfort. After 20 minutes of timing, she told me they were Braxton Hicks, practice contractions that were normal and didn't mean real labor. I felt stupid for overreacting, but Mom just laughed and said every first-time mother panicked over Braxton Hicks at some point. We ended up laughing together about my panic, and she made me tea while explaining how to tell the difference between practice contractions and real ones. At my next therapy session with Esther, I admitted I was terrified of the actual birth and of becoming a mother, scared I wouldn't know what to do, or that something would go wrong. Esther helped me work through the fear, and acknowledged that it was completely normal to be scared while also being excited. She reminded me that women had been giving birth forever, and that I had good support and medical care. The fear didn't go away completely, but talking about it made it feel more manageable. And Thomas's sister reached out through social media with a long private message saying she'd cut contact with Margaret over how she'd treated me. She apologized again for not speaking up at that awful family dinner and said she couldn't stay silent anymore about her mother's cruelty. She asked if she could be part of the baby's life someday, acknowledging that she understood if I said no but hoping I'd consider it. I read the message 3 times trying to decide if she was genuine or if this was some scheme from Margaret. I wrote back cautiously saying we could revisit the conversation after the baby was born, once I saw whether she actually maintained her boundaries with Margaret. I told her I appreciated the apology, but needed to see consistent action over time before trusting her around my daughter. She responded thanking me for even considering it, and promising she was serious about standing up to their mother. Her rebellion against Margaret gave me a tiny bit of hope that not everyone in that family was completely lost, though I stayed guarded about her intentions. Roman surprised me by organizing a baby shower with help from my parents and Aunt Camelia. I walked into my parents' house thinking we were just having Sunday dinner, and found the living room full of people and decorations. Cole was there with his sister. Friends from prenatal class had come, and even Gideon's wife showed up with a beautifully wrapped gift. The house was filled with people who actually loved and supported me, celebrating my daughter's upcoming arrival with genuine joy. Roman had made a banner that said, "Welcome, baby girl," in careful letters and had organized games and food. Everyone brought gifts and shared advice and stories, treating me like family even though some of them barely knew me. I thought about the shower Margaret would have thrown if things had been different, how it would have been about her and her expectations and her vision of the perfect grandchild. This celebration was about welcoming my daughter exactly as she was, with people who would love her no matter what. I cried happy tears when Roman gave a little speech about being excited to be an uncle and promised to teach his niece everything he knew. The contrast between this loving celebration and the Rossi family's cruelty couldn't have been clearer. At 36 weeks, I had everything ready and was just waiting for labor to start. The nursery was complete with the crib assembled and tiny clothes washed and folded in the dresser. I'd packed my hospital bag and installed the car seat and read all the baby care books. My body felt huge and uncomfortable. My back ached constantly, and I couldn't sleep well anymore. But underneath the physical discomfort was a strange sense of peace. I'd built a life that didn't include Thomas or his toxic family, and I was surrounded by people who would love my daughter for exactly who she was. At my therapy session, Esther pointed out how much I'd grown from the devastated woman who'd first come to her office months ago. Then, I'd been broken by Thomas's betrayal and terrified of being a single mother. Now I was confident in my choices and excited to meet my daughter, supported by people who actually cared about me. I'd left a marriage that was destroying me and created something better in its place. Esther was right about the growth, even though I hadn't really noticed it happening gradually over all these months. I woke up at 3 in the morning to a pain that squeezed my entire belly like someone was wringing out a towel. This wasn't the practice contractions I'd been having for weeks. This was real labor, and my daughter was coming. I grabbed my phone and called Mom, trying to keep my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. She answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting for this call, telling me she'd be there in 10 minutes and to time the contractions. Dad's voice came through in the background saying he was calling the hospital to let them know we were coming. The contractions were already 5 minutes apart and lasting almost a minute each, which meant things were moving fast. I grabbed the hospital bag I'd packed weeks ago and sat on the edge of my bed, breathing through another wave of pain that made my whole body tense. Mom arrived and helped me down to the car, her arm around my waist as another contraction hit halfway down the stairs. She drove carefully but quickly through the empty pre-dawn streets while I gripped the door handle and tried to remember the breathing techniques from class. Dad had already called ahead, so when we pulled up to the emergency entrance, a nurse was waiting with a wheelchair. They took me straight up to labor and delivery, bypassing all the normal check-in procedures. The nurse at the desk confirmed my name had been removed from the public patient directory, and security had been notified about the restraining order against the Rossi family. They'd flagged my file so anyone trying to get information about me or visit would be stopped immediately. Knowing those protections were in place, they got me into a delivery room and checked my progress, confirming I was already 6 centimeters dilated, and this baby was definitely coming today. Contractions kept coming harder and closer together, each one feeling like it might split me in half. Mom held my hand and coached my breathing just like we'd practiced, her steady presence keeping me grounded when the pain got overwhelming. She wiped my forehead with a cool cloth and reminded me to relax between contractions, her voice calm and reassuring. The morning crawled by in a blur of pain and breathing, and Mom's voice guiding me through each wave. Cole texted after Mom sent him an update, saying he was rooting for me and couldn't wait to meet the baby. Roman sent a voice message that made me cry, his excited voice saying he couldn't wait to be an uncle and meet his niece or nephew. The labor and delivery nurse was kind and professional, never once asking where my husband was or making me feel less than for being alone. She treated me with respect and dignity, checking on me regularly and explaining everything that was happening. By early afternoon, the contractions were coming so fast I couldn't catch my breath between them, the pain so intense I couldn't think about anything else. Mom stayed right beside me the entire time, never leaving even when I squeezed her hand so hard I probably bruised it. The nurse checked me again and said it was time to push, helping me into position while Mom supported my shoulders. I pushed through contraction after contraction, exhausted and in more pain than I'd ever experienced, but determined to meet my daughter. After what felt like forever, but was actually about an hour of pushing, I felt a sudden release of pressure and heard the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. My baby's cry filled the room and the nurse lifted her up, this tiny, perfect person covered in vernix and blood. They placed her directly on my chest and the world stopped. Everything I'd been through, all the pain and betrayal and fear, disappeared the moment I looked at her face. She had dark hair plastered to her head and my nose, and she was absolutely perfect. Mom was crying and taking pictures, her hands shaking as she captured the moment. The nurse helped clean the baby while she stayed on my chest, and I couldn't stop staring at her tiny fingers and perfect little face. She was healthy and normal and beautiful, everything Margaret said she wouldn't be. I named her Lily after my grandmother, the woman who'd taught me what unconditional love looked like. The nurse recorded her time of birth as 5:47 in the evening after 14 hours of labor. Lily looked up at me with dark eyes, and I felt something shift inside my chest, a love so fierce and protective it took my breath away. This was my daughter, and I would do anything to protect her from people like Thomas and Margaret. Mom leaned over to kiss Lily's head, tears streaming down her face as she whispered welcome to her granddaughter. Nurse took Lily to weigh and measure her while I delivered the placenta and got stitched up, but I kept my eyes on my daughter the whole time. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, and 20 inches long, completely healthy and perfect. They wrapped her in a blanket and gave her back to me, and I held her against my chest, feeling her warmth and hearing her little breathing sounds. It was everything Margaret had tried to take from me, this perfect moment with my perfect daughter. Julie came to check on us a few hours later, examining Lily thoroughly while explaining everything she was checking. She confirmed Lily was completely healthy with excellent APGAR scores and no signs of any genetic conditions. Julie made a point of noting in the chart that the baby showed no characteristics of Down syndrome, creating official medical documentation that proved Margaret's prejudice had been completely baseless. She wrote detailed notes about Lily's normal muscle tone, facial features and reflexes, everything that Margaret had insisted would be wrong. I felt a surge of satisfaction knowing there was now official proof that Margaret had been wrong about everything. Julie smiled at me and said Lily was one of the healthiest newborns she'd seen this month, thriving and alert and absolutely perfect. But mostly I just felt overwhelmed with love for my daughter, this tiny person who was depending on me for everything. Lily made little sounds and moved her hands, and I couldn't stop touching her soft skin and counting her fingers and toes. Mom took more pictures and sent them to Dad and Roman, sharing the news that Lily had arrived safely. My phone buzzed with Thomas's number and my stomach clenched, the brief moment of peace interrupted by his intrusion. I handed the phone to Mom without looking at the message, not wanting his negativity to touch this perfect moment. She read it and her face tightened. Then she typed out a response with basic information and attached a single photo. His reply came back almost immediately, and Mom's expression went from tight to furious. She showed me the screen where Thomas had typed asking if it was normal, using that dehumanizing language even now. My blood pressure spiked and the nurse noticed, asking if everything was okay. I explained briefly about my ex-husband, and she made a note in my chart, then suggested we turn off my phone for now to let me rest. Mom texted Gideon about Thomas's question, and he responded saying to document everything as evidence of his unfitness for custody. Mom sent one final message to Thomas saying all future communication had to go through lawyers, then she blocked his number again. I focused back on Lily, refusing to let Thomas ruin this day. She was sleeping peacefully in my arms, completely unaware of the drama surrounding her existence. This was my daughter, and she deserved better than a father who couldn't even ask about her without using cruel language. The next morning, Roman came to visit, and watching him meet Lily was one of the most beautiful moments of my life. He washed his hands carefully and sat in the chair beside my bed, his movements slow and gentle. I placed Lily in his arms and showed him how to support her head, and he held her like she was made of glass. He talked to her softly, telling her he was her Uncle Roman, and he was going to teach her everything he knew. His face was full of wonder and love as he looked down at her. This person Margaret had called a burden, showing more capability and tenderness than Thomas ever had. Lily made a little sound and Roman's whole face lit up with joy. He told her about the mobile he'd bought for her room and promised to come visit her all the time. Mom took pictures of them together, capturing this moment between uncle and niece. I started crying watching them, thinking about how Margaret had called Roman a stain on humanity, while he was showing more humanity than anyone in the Rossi family possessed. He was going to be an amazing uncle, present and loving and engaged in ways Thomas would never be as a father. Roman stayed for an hour, completely focused on Lily, and asking questions about how to help once we got home. He wanted to know her schedule and what supplies we needed and how he could be useful. This was the person Margaret thought shouldn't exist, showing more love and responsibility than her own son. When he finally handed Lily back to me, he kissed her forehead gently and promised he'd see her soon. After he left, Mom and I both cried happy tears about how perfect that visit had been. That afternoon, a flower delivery arrived at the nurse's station, and my heart dropped when they brought them to my room. The card said they were from Margaret, and I didn't even need to read the message to know it would make me angry. Mom opened the card and her face went red as she read it out loud. Margaret had written that she forgave me and wanted to meet her granddaughter, framing the entire situation like I was the one who'd done something wrong. The audacity of her acting like she was being gracious by forgiving me when she was the one who demanded I abort my healthy baby made me shake with rage. I told the nurse to remove the flowers immediately, and she took them without question, clearly used to family drama in the maternity ward. I called down to the hospital security to confirm no one from the Rossi family had tried to visit, and they assured me the restraining order was in effect and being enforced. Margaret's name was flagged in their system, and she'd be escorted off the property if she showed up. The security officer said they took these situations seriously, and I shouldn't worry about unwanted visitors. Knowing the hospital was protecting us helped calm my racing heart, but I was still furious that Margaret had found out about the birth and tried to insert herself. She probably had someone watching my social media, or had called around to local hospitals. Mom suggested we not post anything publicly about Lily until we were safely home, and I agreed. I wasn't going to give Margaret any more information or opportunities to interfere. This was supposed to be a joyful time, and she was trying to ruin it with her manipulation and victim playing. I focused on Lily instead, holding her close and reminding myself that Margaret had no power over us anymore. The next few days were a struggle with breastfeeding that I hadn't expected. Lily would latch and then pull away crying, and I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. My breasts hurt, and I was exhausted and frustrated, feeling like I was failing at the most basic part of motherhood. The lactation consultant came to my room and spent hours with us, showing me different positions and techniques. She was patient and encouraging, never making me feel stupid for not knowing what to do. Mom sat with us through the sessions, offering support and reminding me that it was okay if breastfeeding didn't work out. She told me stories about struggling with nursing when I was born, how it had taken weeks to figure out. The consultant said Lily had a slightly shallow latch and showed me how to help her get more of the breast in her mouth. We tried different holds and positions, and slowly things started to improve. By day 4, Lily and I had found our rhythm, and feeding became less of a battle and more of a bonding time. I felt proud of myself for pushing through the difficulty instead of giving up, for advocating for the help I needed. Mom praised me for my persistence, and the lactation consultant said I was doing great. It was a small victory, but it felt huge after all the challenges I'd faced. Lily was gaining weight and producing wet diapers, all signs that she was getting enough milk. The nurse said we could go home the next day if everything continued going well, and I felt both excited and terrified about leaving the safety of the hospital. We brought Lily home when she was 5 days old, and Dad had transformed my apartment into a fortress. He'd installed extra locks on the door and a security camera at the entrance, making sure we'd know if anyone tried to approach. He'd also set up the nursery completely, assembling furniture and organizing all the baby supplies. The apartment felt safe and ready for Lily's arrival. Roman showed up within an hour of us getting home, unable to wait any longer to see his niece in her new space. He'd bought her a mobile with elephants that played soft lullabies, and he hung it over her crib himself. Watching him carefully position it at the right height and test the music made my heart swell. My family was welcoming Lily with such pure joy and love, creating a foundation of support that would carry her through life. Dad gave me a quick tutorial on the security system, and Mom helped me set up a feeding station in the nursery. Roman sat on the floor organizing Lily's toys and books, talking to her about all the things they'd do together. This was what family was supposed to look like. People showing up and helping and loving without conditions or judgment. I knew I'd made the right choice leaving Thomas when I looked around my apartment and saw the people who actually cared about me and my daughter. Margaret had been wrong about everything, but especially about what made a family valuable. The first week home was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. Lily woke up every 2 hours to feed, and I was so exhausted I could barely think straight. Mom stayed over most nights, taking the baby for a few hours so I could sleep in longer stretches. She'd bring Lily to me for feedings and then take her back, changing diapers and rocking her while I rested. Cole stopped by with meals his sister had cooked, understanding without being told that I needed practical help more than advice. He'd hold Lily while I ate, talking to her softly about his own baby who'd be arriving in a few months. His sister had sent enough food for several days, casseroles and soups that I could heat up quickly. I was running on adrenaline and love, discovering reserves of strength I didn't know I had. Every time I wanted to cry from exhaustion, I'd look at Lily's perfect face and find the energy to keep going. Mom kept telling me it would get easier, that these early weeks were the hardest, but they'd pass quickly. Roman came over after work each day, giving me a break to shower or nap while he watched Lily. He was so gentle and careful with her, supporting her head and talking to her constantly. I'd wake up from naps to find him reading her books or singing songs, completely engaged with his niece. This was my new normal, exhausting and overwhelming, but also filled with more love than I'd ever experienced. Lily was worth every sleepless night and every moment of difficulty. I was building a life for us that was based on love and support, not control and prejudice. Thomas and Margaret had no place in this world I was creating, and I was okay with that. A week after we got home, Gideon called to tell me Thomas's lawyer had sent a formal request for paternity testing before Thomas would agree to pay child support. He explained it was Thomas's legal right, even though the request felt like another insult on top of everything else. I agreed to the test immediately because I knew without any doubt that Lily was Thomas's daughter, and I wanted the legal obligation established as quickly as possible. We scheduled the appointment at a certified facility where they swabbed Lily's cheek and mine, and the whole process took less than 10 minutes. The results came back 2 weeks later confirming what I already knew, that Thomas was Lily's biological father, and legally required to begin support payments. His lawyer sent another message requesting minimal visitation to start, supervised visits only, and I agreed through Gideon because I wanted Lily to have the option of knowing her father, even if he was a terrible person. 3 weeks after Lily was born, Gideon forwarded me a letter from Margaret's attorney demanding grandparent visitation rights. The letter claimed I was alienating her from her grandchild without cause, and that she had a legal right to a relationship with Lily. I felt my blood pressure spike reading Margaret's twisted version of events where she was the victim of my vindictiveness. Gideon spent the next week preparing a detailed response that included documentation of every instance of harassment, every coercion attempt, every violation of the restraining order. He attached Julie's medical records proving that all of Margaret's claims about genetic defects were scientifically false, and he included statements from witnesses at that original family dinner. The hearing was scheduled for a month later, and I showed up with Gideon while Margaret sat across the courtroom with her expensive lawyer looking confident. The judge reviewed all the evidence, listened to both sides, and denied Margaret's petition completely. He warned her attorney that any further legal harassment would result in sanctions against both of them, and Margaret's face went red with anger as she stormed out of the courtroom. At Lily's 2-week pediatrician appointment, Julie did a complete examination and confirmed that Lily was thriving perfectly. She'd gained back her birth weight plus extra, and all her reflexes and responses were exactly what they should be. Julie asked how I was doing emotionally and physically, and I admitted I was exhausted beyond anything I'd ever experienced, but also happier than I expected to be. She nodded like she understood completely, and told me about a postpartum support group for single mothers that met at the hospital every Wednesday evening. I started attending the following week, and I met other women navigating parenthood alone for various reasons. Some were divorced like me, others had partners who died or left, and we all understood the unique challenges of doing this without the support we'd expected to have. The group became a lifeline where I could talk honestly about the hard parts without judgment. Thomas's first supervised visitation happened when Lily was 3 weeks old at a family court facility with observation rooms. I sat behind a one-way window watching as a supervisor brought Lily into the room and placed her in Thomas's arms. He held her stiffly like she might break, his whole body tense and uncomfortable. For 30 minutes, he just sat there not talking to her or engaging with her at all, occasionally shifting his position but mostly staring at the wall. When the time was up, he handed Lily back to the supervisor with visible relief. The supervisor told me afterward that Thomas had mentioned needing to work up to longer visits, that he wasn't ready for more time yet. I drove home with Lily sleeping in her car seat and realized with complete clarity that Thomas was never going to be a real father to her. He was going through the motions because the court required it, not because he wanted a relationship with his daughter. Roman asked if he could babysit so I could go to my therapy appointment with Esther, and I hesitated before agreeing because it felt like such a big responsibility. I left detailed instructions and my cell phone number and mom's number, and I rushed through my session worried about how things were going. When I got home an hour later, I found Roman sitting on the floor with Lily on a blanket, singing to her softly while showing her a picture book about animals. He'd changed her diaper without any problems and fed her a full bottle of the milk I'd pumped that morning. Lily was completely content, and Roman was beaming with pride at being trusted with his niece. I tried to pay him for babysitting, but he protested, saying family doesn't charge family. I insisted because I wanted him to understand that his help had real value and that his time mattered, and he finally accepted the money with a shy smile. Margaret made one final attempt to contact me by showing up at my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon when she knew I visited on weekends. Dad saw her car pull up through the front window and called the police immediately, while Mom moved me and Lily into the back bedroom. The officers arrived within minutes and found Margaret on the front porch demanding to see her grandchild. They arrested her right there for violating the restraining order, and she spent a night in jail before posting bail the next morning. The judge called a hearing and extended the restraining order for 5 more years, with a stern warning that any further violations would result in serious jail time, not just overnight stays. Margaret's lawyer tried to argue that she was just a grandmother who wanted to meet her grandchild, but the judge cut him off and said the restraining order existed for documented good reasons. I returned to my job at the marketing firm when Lily was 8 weeks old, nervous about how I'd manage everything. My boss had held my position like she promised, and told me she was flexible about my hours if I needed to leave for pediatrician appointments or emergencies. Mom agreed to watch Lily during the day at her house, and I set up a pumping schedule during my breaks to maintain my milk supply. The juggling act of working motherhood was harder than I expected, rushing to pump every 3 hours and worrying about Lily all day. Cole's sister heard I was looking into daycares for the future and recommended a place near my apartment that her friends' kids attended. I started touring facilities on weekends, looking for somewhere that felt safe and nurturing for when I was ready to make that transition. 2 months after his first visit, Thomas completed his required parenting classes, and his lawyer filed a request for expanded visitation time. Gideon pulled the attendance records and discovered Thomas had missed 3 scheduled visits without calling ahead or rescheduling. At the hearing, Gideon argued that Thomas's inconsistency showed he wasn't ready for unsupervised time with an infant, that he couldn't be trusted to show up reliably. The judge reviewed the records and agreed to maintain supervised visits only, denying the request for expansion. Thomas looked relieved rather than disappointed when the judge made the ruling, and I realized he'd filed the motion because someone told him he should, not because he actually wanted more time with Lily. He was doing the absolute minimum the court required and nothing more. At Lily's 3-month checkup, Julie commented on how alert and social she was, tracking faces and responding to voices. She was meeting all her developmental milestones ahead of schedule, rolling over early and holding her head up strongly. Julie noted everything in her chart with obvious pleasure, and she mentioned what a happy baby Lily was. Roman had visited almost daily since she was born, and Lily's whole face lit up whenever he walked into the room. Sitting in Julie's office watching her document Lily's perfect health, I thought about Margaret's predictions of a damaged, burdensome child who would drain resources and embarrass the family. Margaret had been completely wrong about everything, and Lily was thriving surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. A friend from my support group mentioned that her cousin was single and looking to meet someone, and she asked if I'd be interested in being set up. The idea of dating felt strange with a 3-month-old baby, but it also felt empowering to even consider romance on my own terms. I met him for coffee one afternoon when Mom was watching Lily, and he knew up front that I was a single mom and said he was fine with that. We talked easily about work and hobbies and life, and it felt good to be seen as a whole person, instead of just a mother or an ex-wife. I started seeing Esther weekly again to process my trust issues, and she helped me recognize that not everyone would betray me like Thomas did. She pointed out that I was building a life where I chose people who accepted my whole reality instead of trying to fit into someone else's expectations, and that was real growth. A few weeks later, Thomas's sister reached out through a text message asking if she could meet Lily. She'd kept her distance from Margaret since the arrest, and wanted to prove she was serious about maintaining boundaries. I talked to Gideon first, and he said supervised visits were fine as long as I felt comfortable, so I agreed to meet at the park near my apartment on a Saturday morning. Mira arrived right on time carrying a small gift bag, and she looked nervous when she approached the bench where I sat with Lily in her stroller. She knelt down to Lily's level and spoke softly, telling her what a beautiful baby she was, and then she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. She apologized again for not speaking up at that family dinner, admitting she'd been a coward when I needed someone to defend me. I told her I appreciated the apology, but actions mattered more than words, and she nodded and said she understood completely. Lily grabbed her finger and smiled, and Mira lit up at the simple gesture. We spent an hour at the park with her pushing Lily on the baby swings and asking questions about her schedule and personality, and she never once mentioned Margaret or made excuses for the family's behavior. Over the following months, she proved reliable, texting before visits and respecting when I said no to certain requests. She sent photos to Margaret apparently, but she never tried to facilitate contact or guilt me about the restraining order. By the time Lily was 5 months old, I trusted her enough to let her babysit for an hour while I ran errands, and she handled it perfectly. The letter arrived from Margaret's lawyer on a Tuesday afternoon when I was feeding Lily her bottle. The return address made my stomach drop, but I opened it with steady hands, curious what new manipulation she'd attempt. The letter wasn't a legal demand or threat, just 2 pages of Margaret claiming she was the real victim in this situation. She wrote that I'd turned her son against her, destroyed her family, and stolen her only grandchild out of vindictive spite. She claimed that someday I'd regret denying Lily a relationship with her grandmother, that I was depriving my daughter of family connections she deserved. The letter painted Margaret as a concerned grandmother whose love was rejected, completely rewriting history to erase her demand that I abort my baby. There was no acknowledgement of what she'd actually said or done, no recognition that her prejudice and cruelty had caused this separation. I read it twice and felt absolutely nothing except relief that Lily would never be subjected to this woman's toxic worldview. I texted Gideon a photo of the letter, and he called me back within minutes. He said to keep it as documentation but not to respond in any way, that Margaret was trying to create a paper trail to make herself look reasonable. He noted that she'd carefully avoided making any demands or threats that would violate the restraining order, showing she understood the legal consequences of further harassment. I filed the letter in my growing folder of Margaret documentation and went back to feeding Lily, grateful that my daughter would grow up surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally, instead of with conditions and prejudice. Cole and I planned a joint party for our baby's 6-month milestones, renting a pavilion at the park and inviting both our families and friends. His son was a week older than Lily, but they'd been photographed together since birth. 2 babies who'd never know their parents were once married to other people. Cole's sister brought decorations, and my mom made a cake, and we had about 30 people show up to celebrate these 2 kids who represented new beginnings for both of us. Lily wore a little dress with butterflies, and Cole's son had a tiny bow tie, and we took about 100 photos of them sitting together on a blanket. Roman was in his element, entertaining both babies and making them laugh with silly faces and sounds. Cole's family had fully embraced me over the past months, including me in their Sunday dinners and holiday plans, and my family had done the same for Cole. We'd become each other's support system in a way that felt more solid than romance, built on shared experience and mutual respect. During the party, Cole's sister joked that we should just get married for the tax benefits, and we both laughed because our friendship was too valuable to complicate with romance. He understood the challenges of single parenting in a way my married friends didn't, and I understood his complicated feelings about his ex-wife in a way his family couldn't. We texted almost daily about baby milestones and parenting struggles, and we'd established a routine of trading babysitting so each of us could have occasional kid-free time. Watching our families blend together at the party, I realized this friendship had become one of the most valuable relationships in my life. Lily started solid foods right after turning 6 months, and Roman was completely fascinated by the entire process. He'd come over during feeding times to watch me prepare the baby cereal and mashed vegetables, asking questions about portions and textures and timing. He wanted to try feeding her himself, So I showed him how to hold the tiny spoon and scrape excess food off her chin, and he took to it immediately. He'd make airplane noises and silly faces to get Lily to open her mouth, celebrating every successful bite like it was a major achievement. He remembered her schedule better than I did sometimes, texting me reminders about when to introduce new foods, or asking if she'd tried sweet potatoes yet. Thomas had missed the last 2 scheduled visitations without calling, but Roman showed up almost daily to spend time with his niece. He'd learned all her preferences and quirks, knowing she liked to hold a toy while eating, and that she made a specific face before spitting out food she disliked. Watching him carefully spoon mashed peas into Lily's mouth while narrating the process in a gentle voice, I felt anger rise up at Margaret's prejudice all over again. This was the person she'd called a burden who couldn't contribute to society, and he was showing more patience and love than Thomas had ever demonstrated. But mostly I felt grateful that Lily had Roman in her life, that she'd grow up knowing her uncle's kindness and dedication, instead of viewing people with disabilities through Margaret's hateful lens. Thomas's lawyer filed a motion requesting reduced child support when Lily was 7 months old, claiming Thomas was experiencing financial hardship. Gideon immediately started investigating and discovered Thomas had bought a new sports car 2 months earlier and taken an expensive vacation to Mexico with friends. He'd posted photos all over social media showing him at fancy restaurants and beach resorts, hardly the behavior of someone struggling financially. Gideon compiled the evidence and filed a response that included screenshots of Thomas's spending, and we went before the judge on a cold morning in November. Thomas's lawyer tried to argue that the car was necessary for work and the vacation had been a gift, but the judge wasn't buying it. She reviewed the financial records and denied the request for reduced support, warning Thomas about filing frivolous motions and wasting the court's time. Thomas looked annoyed rather than relieved, like he'd expected to get away with it. After that hearing, he stopped attending visitation regularly, missing appointments and canceling at the last minute with vague excuses. The supervised visitation supervisor called me after the 3rd consecutive no-show to ask if I wanted to continue scheduling appointments, and I said yes, but I wasn't surprised when he didn't come. I realized Thomas was slowly removing himself from Lily's life by choice, that being a father was too much work when he couldn't control the terms. Part of me felt sad that Lily's biological father was choosing not to be present, but mostly I felt relieved that she wouldn't grow up with his rejection and half-hearted presence. Lily's 9-month checkup fell on a Friday morning, and Julie spent extra time examining her and noting everything in her chart. She commented on how exceptionally healthy Lily was, how she was hitting all her developmental milestones early, and showed advanced social skills for her age. Lily babbled constantly, and pulled herself up to standing, and she recognized familiar faces, and showed clear preferences for certain people. Julie smiled while writing in her file, and then she looked up at me with understanding in her eyes. She asked if I wanted her to include specific documentation about Lily's normal development, and I said yes because I wanted a paper trail in case Margaret ever tried legal action again. Julie nodded and spent several minutes writing detailed notes that specifically refuted any claims about genetic defects or disabilities, creating comprehensive medical documentation of Lily's perfect health. She included notes about Lily's cognitive development, physical abilities, and social engagement, making it clear that this child showed no signs of any developmental concerns whatsoever. I thanked her for understanding why the documentation mattered, and she said she'd seen too many cases where prejudiced family members tried to use medical concerns as weapons. She printed me a copy of her notes to keep with my other legal files, and I added it to the folder that contained Margaret's harassment letters and the restraining order paperwork. My boss called me into her office on a Monday morning, and I thought I was in trouble, but instead she offered me a promotion. The marketing director position had opened up, and she said I'd proven myself capable despite taking maternity leave, that my work was consistently excellent, and clients requested me specifically. The promotion came with a significant raise that would let me move to a larger apartment, and I accepted immediately. I spent my lunch break looking at rental listings, finding a 2-bedroom place in a better neighborhood with a proper nursery and space for Lily to play as she grew. Dad helped me move on a Saturday, loading boxes into his truck while Mom watched Lily. Cole showed up with his pickup truck without being asked, saying he remembered how much help he'd needed when he moved. Roman took charge of organizing Lily's toys in her new room, arranging her books by color and setting up her playmat near the window. The new apartment had better security and was closer to my parents' house, and the nursery had space for a reading chair and proper storage. Unpacking that night while Lily slept in her new crib, I looked around at what I'd built and felt proud. My life looked nothing like I'd planned when I married Thomas, with his big house and promises of a perfect family. But this was better than I'd imagined, built on my own choices and hard work, instead of trying to fit into someone else's vision. Thomas missed 6 consecutive scheduled visitations without calling or rescheduling, and Gideon said we had grounds to file for termination of his parental rights based on abandonment. I thought about it for a week, considering whether Lily might want a relationship with her biological father someday, but ultimately decided that growing up with his rejection would hurt more than never knowing him. Gideon filed the motion, and we got a court date for January, right after Lily's first birthday. Thomas's lawyer called to say Thomas wouldn't contest the termination, that he agreed it was best for everyone involved. The hearing was brief, just 10 minutes before a judge who reviewed the visitation records and Thomas's lack of involvement. She asked Thomas directly if he understood he was giving up all parental rights permanently, and he said yes without hesitation. She asked if he understood this meant no contact with the child and no obligation for child support, and again he said yes. He looked relieved when the judge signed the papers, like a burden had been lifted, and I felt sad for Lily that her biological father was choosing to walk away completely. But I also felt grateful she wouldn't grow up with his half-hearted presence, with a father who saw her as an obligation rather than a gift. The judge terminated his rights and released him from support obligations, and Thomas left the courtroom without looking at me or asking about Lily. Roman came over that evening and asked if Lily could call him Uncle Roman when she started talking. I told him she absolutely would because he'd earned that title through his constant presence and love, that he'd been more of a parent figure than Thomas ever was. He'd shown up for every milestone, every doctor's appointment I'd invited him to, every random Tuesday when I just needed help. He'd learned to change diapers and prepare bottles, and he'd researched child development so he could support Lily's growth. Everything Margaret believed about people with Down syndrome was ignorant prejudice, proven wrong by Roman's capability and dedication. Lily adored him and lit up whenever he walked in the room, reaching for him and babbling excitedly when she heard his voice. He was going to be the male role model in her life, the person who showed her what unconditional love looked like. Watching him hold her that night while singing a lullaby he'd memorized, I felt grateful for the family I'd chosen instead of the one I'd married into. Lily's first birthday party filled my parents' backyard with people who actually loved her. Mom had decorated with pink and gold balloons, and Dad had set up tables loaded with food. Roman hung a banner he'd made himself, and Cole brought his son who was now walking and getting into everything. My support group friends came with their kids, and even Mira showed up with a carefully chosen gift. Lily wore a little crown and seemed confused by all the attention, but she smiled at everyone who talked to her. We did the cake smash photos with Lily sitting in her high chair, and she grabbed handfuls of frosting and smeared it everywhere while laughing. Her joy was pure and unself-conscious, and everyone took photos of her covered in pink frosting with cake in her hair. I snapped a picture on my phone of her mid-laugh, frosting on her nose and pure happiness on her face, surrounded by people who loved her for exactly who she was. This was what family actually looked like. Not the cold judgment of the Rossi household, but this warm chaos of people who showed up and stayed. I pushed the shopping cart down the produce aisle while Lily sat in the seat, her little legs swinging. She was 14 months old now and walking everywhere at home, but the cart kept her contained while I grabbed groceries. She babbled constantly, pointing at bright-colored fruits and making up words that almost sounded real. I was reaching for apples when I felt someone staring at us from across the aisle. Margaret stood frozen near the bananas, her eyes locked on Lily. The restraining order meant she couldn't approach within 50 feet, but nothing stopped her from looking. Lily chose that moment to laugh at something, a pure, joyful sound that echoed through the produce section. She clapped her tiny hands together and said something that sounded like Mama Apple, while pointing. Margaret's face changed as she watched, and I saw the exact moment she realized her granddaughter was perfect. Lily was healthy and thriving and clearly developing normally. Everything Margaret had insisted was impossible with my genetics. I felt satisfaction bloom in my chest as I watched Margaret's expression shift from shock to something that might have been regret. I turned the cart around and headed toward the checkout, leaving Margaret standing there among the bananas. Her loss was entirely her own fault, and I didn't waste another thought on her. Mira called me a week later, her voice careful and measured. She said Thomas wanted me to know he was getting remarried, as if his life updates mattered to me anymore. I asked why she was telling me this, and she hesitated before admitting Thomas had told his fiancée he didn't have children. He'd erased Lily completely from his new life, pretending she didn't exist so he could start fresh without the complication of a daughter. The words stung for maybe 30 seconds before I realized it was actually perfect. Lily would never know the pain of a father who showed up occasionally out of obligation, never experienced the confusion of being treated like a burden. Thomas removing himself so completely was a gift, even if he didn't mean it that way. I thanked Mira for letting me know and hung up, then went to check on Lily, who was napping in her crib. She slept peacefully, one hand curled under her chin, completely unaware that her biological father had chosen to pretend she didn't exist. Better this than years of disappointment and half-hearted visits. Roman came over that afternoon like he did most days after work, and Lily heard his voice from her room. She pulled herself up using the crib rails and started bouncing excitedly, making the sounds she made when she wanted out. I lifted her and she immediately reached for Roman, babbling her greeting. He took her and started their usual routine of silly faces and songs, and that's when she said it. Unka. The word was clear and deliberate. Her eyes locked on Roman's face. Unka. Unka. Roman froze, tears filling his eyes instantly. He looked at me like he needed confirmation he'd heard correctly, and I nodded while my own eyes got wet. Lily patted his cheek and said it again, proud of her new word. Roman held her close and cried happy tears while she kept repeating Unka, like she'd discovered something wonderful. She was growing into such a confident, joyful toddler, surrounded by people who loved her completely. She'd never know about Margaret's cruelty or Thomas's rejection, never understand that his family had wanted her aborted before she was born. Every day I felt grateful that I'd chosen to protect her from that toxicity, even though leaving Thomas had been terrifying at the time. Watching Roman with her now, seeing how much he loved being her uncle, I knew I'd made the right choice. At Lily's 18-month checkup, Julie measured and weighed her, checking all the developmental milestones. Lily cooperated cheerfully, showing off her walking and her growing vocabulary, pointing at things and naming them with her toddler pronunciation. Julie finished the exam and looked at me with a smile. She said she'd been a pediatrician for 15 years and she'd never seen a happier, healthier child than Lily. The words hit me harder than I expected, and I had to blink back tears. I'd built this beautiful life from the ashes of my marriage, created a safe and loving home for my daughter, with help from my family and friends. I was a successful single mother with an amazing support system, a daughter who was thriving, and the confidence that every choice I'd made was right. Margaret had been wrong about everything, her prejudice and her predictions and her certainty that my genetics would produce a defective child. Thomas had revealed his true character when it mattered most, showing me he'd always choose his mother's approval over doing what was right. Lily and I were so much better off without them, surrounded instead by people like Roman and my parents and Julie who loved us unconditionally. I buckled Lily into her car seat after the appointment, listening to her babble about the stickers Julie had given her, and I felt completely at peace with my life.